The Revolutionary War, Part 2, or the War of 1812. Chapter 15, The New Nation. George Washington warned Americans to stay out of foreign quarrels. Unfortunately, England and France wouldn't let us do that. It would have been nice if they had left our infant nation alone. This country needed a few years to grow up without having old friends pick on us. But that wasn't to be. And so we went to war. This is how it came about. As you know, soon after our revolution, France had a revolution of its own. At first, everyone thought the French Revolution would be like the one in America, but it got out of hand. The winners of the revolution began chopping off the heads of the losers, really, with a head chopping machine called a guillotine. Then Napoleon came to power. He tried to conquer most of Europe, and England declared war on France. Americans had a hard time trying to figure out what was going on across the ocean. News traveled slowly. We tried to stay out of the European war. We tried to stay neutral, but neither England nor France respected nations that were neutral. Both countries captured American ships and took American sailors as prisoners. The British sea captains forced American sailors to work on British ships. Naturally, that made people in this country angry. There was something else that made Americans angry with England. England had never cleared out of the forts held in its territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. England was supposed to leave after the Revolutionary War. Many English men and women seemed to believe that someday America would again be part of the British Empire. Capturing ships and holding territory, those are two pretty good reasons for fighting. There was a third reason that wasn't so good. Americans wanted Indian land. But the English in their western forts had become friends and protectors of the Indians. Americans were divided. Most New Englanders did not want to get involved in another war with England. England controlled the seas, and New England depended upon its sea trade. Most Westerners and some Southerners wanted to go to war. Scholarly James Madison was 63, and president was cautious. But in Congress and across the land, a new generation of leaders was taking the place of men who had fought in the Revolution. These new leaders had been youngsters when the Constitution was written. They didn't have the memories of the old days when there were good feelings towards England. They didn't remember the long, hard battles of the Revolutionary War. All they heard were stories of battle and valor and victory. They were eager to fight. Henry Clay from Kentucky was one of the new leaders. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee was another. Those who wanted to go to war were called war hawks. They finally convinced President Madison that the nation's honor was at stake. In 1812, war was declared against Great Britain. The war hawks thought they could march to Canada and take all that land from England. Henry Clay boasted that the Kentucky militia could do it all by itself. When it came to the sea, however, he thought differently, and so did most Americans. They believed the famous English Navy would easily outfight them. Were they surprised? Canada didn't fall to the American forces. The Americans fought poorly in Canada. But the little American Navy won some surprising victories against the big British Navy, and no one in the world expected that. But the War of 1812, which really should be called the War of 1812 to 1815, because that's how long it lasted, started slowly. Then the war in Europe, the one between England and France, ended. Napoleon lost. That was terrible for the United States. It meant the English could now send more soldiers to America. They did. In 1814, they sailed an army into Chesapeake Bay, landed redcoats, whipped American troops at Bladensburg, 5 miles from Washington, D.C., and then marched on, heading for the nation's capital. By that time, there were hardly any American soldiers in the city. They'd all fled, and those residents who were still around keeping quiet about it behind their shuttered windows. The British commander, Major General Robert Ross, had orders to destroy and lay waste the towns he captured. Ross, however, was prepared to negotiate with Washington's leaders. If they paid ransom, he might spare the city. but there weren't any leaders to be found. So the general sent his soldiers to burn Congress's home, the Capitol, but it was so well built, they had a hard time of it. They plied up chairs and books and drapes and torched them. Finally, much of the buildings went. Then they headed towards the president's house. James Madison wasn't at home. He had been at Bladensburg, and now he was off somewhere consulting with his generals. He was courageous, but when it came to military leadership, he was a dud. It was his wife Dolly that was the indomitable member of the family. She was in the president's house getting ready to have dinner with friends. Dolly was advised to flee, but before she did, the First Lady took important papers, silverware, and red velvet drapes and had them loaded onto a wagon. She got out just before the British arrived. The British toasted the king with the president's Madeira wine and ate Dolly's dinner. The wine was still chilled, and the meats laid out handsomely. After dinner, the British set a bonfire inside the president's house. From there, they carried their torches to the treasury and were disappointed to find no money inside. They burned that building, and they burned the Library of Congress too. Dr. William Thornton, the architect of the Capitol, remember he won the contest to design it, was brave enough to stand outside the patent office and convince the soldiers that they would be destroying inventive science if they burned that building, so they spared it. But the next day, a storm erupted with wind and rain so intense that the roof was blown off the patent office with some inventions from it. The British soldiers were now eager to march on to Baltimore. They hated that place. With its 45,000 inhabitants, it was the fourth largest city in the States. But it was Baltimore's private sailing ships that made them angry. Privateers from Baltimore had been capturing and sinking British ships. No mercy was to be shown at Baltimore. Word went up and down the coast that Baltimore was expected to fall, and after Baltimore, who knew where the British would head? Gloom hovered like a fog over much of the country. Citizens from Alexandria and Georgetown rushed to surrender to the British without even being asked. Annapolis got ready to give up too, but the British fleet sailed right by that town. They were after the bigger city up the river. They called it Mob Town. They didn't know that something was happening at Baltimore that was changing the mood of despair. Major General Samuel Smith, who had leadership genes in every one of his cells, had taken charge of the city. He put Baltimore citizens to work. It wasn't easy for him to get the rich merchants to agree to sink their own ships in the harbor to make a barrier to keep out the English, but Smith convinced them that it was better than losing everything if the city fell. Trenches were dug, cannons put in place, and a citizen militia which had performed miserably at Bladensburg was drilled and drilled again. A letter printed in the Evening Post said, "White and black are all working together. You'll see a master and slave digging side by side." There was no distinction whatsoever. Baltimore Harbor was guarded by a big, star-shaped Fort Mchenry. Major General George Armistead commanded that fort. Early in the war, Armistead went to Mary Pickersgill, a well-known Baltimore flag maker, and ordered an American flag so large that British will have no difficulty seeing it at a distance. She and her 13-year-old daughter sewed stripes of red and white English wool bunting and added cotton stars. The huge flag was 42 feet by 30 feet, had 15 stripes and 15 stars, and cost $405.90. Armistead raised it over the fort. The English ships couldn't miss it when they sailed into the harbor. They were soon approached by a small ship of truce. Francis Scott Key, a Washington lawyer who had fought at Bladensburg, had been sent to rescue William Beans, a much-loved doctor who had been taken hostage by the British. Key had letters from British prisoners of war saying they were being treated well. That got Dr. Beans released. But the two men and the truce ship had to wait until the British until the fighting was over. The battle began on a Sunday. May the Lord bless King George, convert him, and take him to heaven, as we want no more of him, said the Reverend John Gruber at Baltimore's Light Street Methodist Church. Then his congregation rushed out and prepared for what was ahead. About the same time, the British Admiral, Sir George Cockburn, was changing his plans. He could see that the ships sunk in the harbor prevented him from sailing right up to the city. He would have to capture Fort Mchenry if he wanted Baltimore. That night, rockets and bombs lit the starless sky like fireworks. The rockets were real whiz-bangers with fire-spouting tails. The English had learned about rockets in India. They used them to frighten their enemies. The rockets were terrifying but not dangerous unless one hit you directly. It was the cannons on the British side that were dangerous. Some of their shells had a range of 2 miles. Nothing in the batteries at Fort McHenry could match that. Were the Americans scared? Well, the all-night bombardment certainly didn't make them feel good. Early in the morning, a British force set out to do battle, but something happened that they hadn't expected. Their commander, General Robert Ross, was killed. The English soldiers were now rudderless. Confusion set in. While British ships were lobbing shells on one side of the Baltimore Peninsula, British infantry foot soldiers marched up the other. They were supposed to coordinate an attack, but there was communications foul-up. The infantry turned back, and the Navy didn't know. Sailors fought to protect soldiers who weren't there. Meanwhile, the bombing of Fort McHenry went on and on for 25 hours. Francis Scott Key on the cruise ship watched the rockets' red glare and listened to bombs bursting in air. And then it stopped. It was very dark and very quiet, and it was raining so hard no one could tell what had happened. Had the fort been captured? No one knew until finally, by the dawn's early light, Key saw Mrs. Pickner's broad stripes and bright stars and realized that the fort had held. The British hadn't been able to scare or beat the Americans. They turned around and sailed away. Francis Scott Key found words spinning in his head. They became a poem, and he called the defense of Fort McHenry. It could be sung to an old British drinking song to Anacreon in heaven. Friends published his poem in Baltimore. Soon it was republished in town after town. Baltimore's heroism inspired the young nation. If Baltimore had fallen, where might the British have marched next? Philadelphia had readied its militia. Now there was jubilation. People were soon singing Key's words, and someone gave them a new name. It was the Star-Spangled Banner.